All right, Alyssa, tell us what's on your radar.
The pundit class will scratch their heads wondering why tens of millions of Americans don't trust American media. We'll look no further than the coverage of Andrew Cuomo. Careful, it might give you whiplash. Liberal media bias was on full display Wednesday following Governor Andrew Cuomo's resignation from office after more than 11 women accused him of sexual harassment and one of assault. The stories are horrifying. Calculated, continued, abusive behavior by a predator who used his position of power to target women around him. First and foremost, thank you to the brave women who spoke out. Every time victims of abuse speak out, it empowers future victims to hold abusers accountable. But now back to the media, who seem to be exempt from any form of accountability whatsoever. Let's take a trip down memory lane and remember some of the media's fawning coverage over Governor Andrew Cuomo. On April 28th, when COVID was on the rise nationwide, the Los Angeles Times ran the headline, quote, Governor Andrew Cuomo approves of people who identify as, quote, homosexuals. Yes, that was an actual headline. On the same day, the death toll from COVID in New York hit 17,638 people. Not to mention, in the months prior, Governor Cuomo had signed an executive order making the fatal decision to put COVID-19 positive patients into nursing homes, resulting in over 10,000 deaths of beloved New York seniors. Liberal cable news ran cover for him for months, praising New York's COVID response despite the high death rate among senior citizens. Then it turned out the governor's office even underreported the number of those who died in his state nursing homes, raising the total to 12,743. Now, after months of cries for justice from family members who lost loved ones in New York's nursing homes, the FBI announced it would investigate whether Cuomo aides provided false data on nursing home deaths. Corruption, rinse, repeat. Then, of course, there was Cuomo's decision to write a book during the height of the pandemic on his handling of the still raging virus and taking a $3.1 million advance. The book was officially released to wide acclaim from mainstream media in October of 2020. On that same day, the death toll in New York reached 25,598 from COVID. The New Yorker glowingly reviewed the book with an article titled, Andrew Cuomo, the King of New York. And as Cuomo's COVID briefings continued, so did the praise from Hollywood celebrities, including Ellen DeGeneres, Sarah Silverman, and Chelsea Handler, who poured praise on him. Comedian Trevor Noah, if you can call him that, displayed Andrew Cuomo's approval ratings on his show and announced that he identifies as a Cuomosexual. Actors like Jada Pinkett Smith and Leonardo DiCaprio praised Cuomo as well. Pinkett Smith took to referring to the governor as her boyfriend. As if the fawning wasn't enough, Andrew Cuomo was then given an Emmy for his masterful COVID briefings. Quote, the governor's 111 daily briefings worked so well because he effectively created television shows with characters, plot lines, and stories of success and failure, the Academy's president and CEO, Bruce Paisner, said. People around the world tuned in to find out what was going on, and New York became a symbol of the determination to fight back. Never mind the fact that New York continued to have one of the worst responses in the country to COVID, and the death toll continued to tick up. Fast forward to the last few months, when allegation after allegation of sexual misconduct against Governor Cuomo came to light. Many in the media suddenly went quiet on their favorite star governor. The celebrity fawners went quiet. They didn't say a word. But this entire episode is indicative of something much greater than the actions of a creepy former governor of New York catching up with him. It's indicative of why the public has lost so much faith in the mainstream media. That's why it's no surprise that trust in the mainstream media is at an all-time low. Fewer than half of all Americans have trust in traditional media, according to data from Edelman's annual trust barometer. 58% think that most news organizations are more concerned with supporting an ideology or political position than with informing the public. It is clear as day that the narrative was set. Andrew Cuomo was a hero of COVID. Donald Trump and Republican governors were villains, regardless of where the facts lie. Americans are smart. They can find their own information. They can educate themselves on the failures during COVID. And now they're not buying the media suddenly distancing themselves from the golden boy of the last year. Kim, what do you make of all this?
Well, everybody's a partisan hack. I mean, you're absolutely right that there is 100% a liberal media bias, and there's also a conservative media bias. And, I just want to point out that Alyssa Milano, this is the type of bias we're sort of seeing, is that Alyssa Milano, who has been a big voice of the resistance, right, goes to Twitter, and her announcement of Cuomo resigning, she says, Cuomo resigns, and then she follows it with, and this is your reminder that Representative Matt Gaetz still has a job, is able to fundraise, has not been stripped of any of his positions on committees or in caucuses, and is being investigated for sex with a minor and transporting her across state lines. Elect more women. So it was like, rather than talking about all of the women victims of Cuomo, she immediately deflects to the other side. So it's kind of to your point.
Yeah, and what Cuomo did around the nursing homes and his book, I think, as it continues to be investigated, which I hope it will be, you're going to see that it was even worse than it looks like on the surface. And on the surface, it looks awful because he got this huge advance for his book. He needed the public to continue to believe that he was handling COVID successfully. In order to do that, he had to cover up these nursing home deaths. So it wasn't just a typical cover-up in which he's trying to keep his approval ratings high or keep a scandal out of the press. He was trying to keep his approval rating up around COVID specifically because he'd gotten this multi-million-dollar book deal. And that, to me, takes it to another level of corruption.
Well, that's a really good point, Ryan, because, something that you guys are familiar with is New York actually got some of the most help in the country early on in COVID. So they had the Comfort deployed, the Mercy deployed. They had field hospitals stood up by the National Guard. They had capacity to treat COVID patients. And the governor made the wrong decisions to co-locate people with elderly people who would be more vulnerable to the illness, rather than utilizing those field hospitals that the U.S. government had set up for them. So it really is. He wants to take credit for something and had to try to keep the narrative that he did a good job when the facts obviously lay elsewhere. But again, I'm not surprised that the media didn't cover this in real time. They're only starting to cover it because the narrative was set. He's a good guy. Republican governors were the bad guys.
Well, and one of the other issues with this is if they focus too much on the nursing home deaths and his response to COVID, then you have to start questioning every other governor's response to COVID. And there's, it's a pandemic. It was a really unknown. There's a lot of mistakes that have been made in hindsight. Whereas if you focus everything on Cuomo and the women, then, you're dealing with a narrower group. Well, you're supposed to be dealing with a narrower group. There's a lot more men out there and women out there who are abusing their position of power. But nonetheless, this allows them to sort of focus on that, and he resigns over that rather than having to do a bigger probe into his COVID response.
Right, and one extra point on the nursing home, he allowed nursing homes to write legislation that exempted them from liability. And after they were exempted from liability, they took a lot fewer precautions in keeping people from getting sick and dying. Just an absolute horrific toll of human suffering on his conscience. And a lot of it over this book deal and over the Emmy and over this idea that he was this, handling COVID better than anybody else in the country. And I remember in real time, what are we talking about? There's so many people catching COVID and dying in New York. This is not a success. Even aside from everything else, it was, and I think it was related to Trump. It was, the media wanted somebody that they could say, this is a better, more responsible way of handling it than this buffoon over here is doing.
Yes, and I think they have the second highest death rate in the country, right, behind New Jersey.
I believe that's correct. That's correct. And I would say, the common theme throughout Governor Cuomo's many scandals, because I agree with Kim, it's really the women that ultimately brought him down. But I think it's just this arrogance, this idea that he knew better at every turn and that he felt like he could get away with things because he always had. That was the case with the COVID deaths, with the nursing homes, and then abusing his power with regard to these women. So I'm thrilled to see him go. I know many women around the country are as well. Team Rising joins us next.